started with accessibility can be a bit intimidating, especially the getting started part. Where to start? Every project will be a little different, whether the application is brand new and we're in the planning stage before any code is even written. The application already exists and needs to be converted. It uses modern technology, or is a legacy. Our experiences will differ from project to project. My first project that had accessibility as a fundamental requirement was a legacy application which up to that point was not required to be accessible. We were on one of those all-hand type calls being told that starting the next upgrade we would have to be compliant. Lots of acronyms and terms I had never heard before were being thrown about, so I Googled it and then asked a singular question. What level of compliance are we going to be required to meet? Because I knew enough to even ask, I was now the most knowledgeable person on my team. Oops. Thankfully, it panned out, and I was given the time to research what making our application accessible was going to entail, and connected with an accessibility expert on a different team to guide me. The moral of the story here is that 1, everyone must start somewhere, and 2, the panic moment of where do I even start figuring out what I need to know happens to all of us. In this talk, we're going to talk about exactly that. 1, what accessibility as it relates to the web is. 2, how to get started. And 3, what questions you need to be asking as you go along. Hi everyone, my name is Martine Dowden and I work for Andromeda Galactic Solutions. We do product development, consulting, training, and I know, big shocker, accessibility consulting and training. Before we get into the thick and things, let's take a trip back in time and look at where the concept of accessibility on the web began. As early as 1945, Vannevar Bush said, "Consider a future device in which an individual stores all of his books, records, and communications, and which is mechanized so that it may be consulted with exceeding speed and flexibility. It is an enlarged, intimate supplement to his memory." What is described here is what we today would call the internet. Fast forward to 1975, where we see the first commercial reading machine created by Ray Kurzweil, a machine that could scan a book or document and read it out loud to the user. A central theme here is that sharing and availability of information, a concept that will be at the core of creating the internet. Even though the first web browser was created in 1990 by Sir Tim Berners-Lee while working at CERN, we will not see an official accessibility initiative until 1997. WAY, the W3 Accessibility Initiative, is launched with a goal to develop standards and support material for accessibility. As part of the launch of WAY in 1997, Sir Tim Berners-Lee states, "Worldwide, there are more than 750 million people with disabilities. As we move towards a highly connected world, it is critical that the web be usable by everyone, regardless of individual capabilities and disabilities." He continues with, "The W3C is committed to removing accessibility barriers for all people with disabilities, including the deaf, blind, physically challenged, and cognitive or visually impaired. We plan to work aggressively with government, industry, and community leaders to establish and attain web accessibility goals." By 2001, those numbers were up to an estimated 1 billion, or about 50% of the global population. It won't be until 4 years later in 2001 that we see the first public draft of the Web Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, a set of documents that explain how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities. So I've used the term accessibility a number of times already, but what does it actually mean? In the context of the web, accessibility is the ability to interact with a product or service and gain the same benefit from the interaction regardless of device used or capability of the user. That's a tall order. Essentially, it says that no matter whom uses any device, we should all be able to get the same information and do the same thing. Now, I'm sure the developers in the room are shuddering at the statement, so let's break it down a bit. A side note, often used to mean accessibility is the numeronym A11Y. It takes the first and last letter of the word and the number of letters in between. It's often seen as a hashtag on Twitter, for example. There is some debate in the community as to whether using the numeronym is accessible, so for readability, it's better to use the full word as much as possible. We stated that accessibility is the ability to interact with a product or service and gain the same benefit from the interaction regardless of device use or capability of the user. To interact means that we should be able to perceive the information. We need to be able to discern the content being presented to us. Not only that it is there, but also be able to process and consume it. Think of showing and hiding content on a website. Can we tell that a pop-up has just opened while using a screen reader? Understand, we need to understand what we are looking at. There are several layers here. The actual words on the page. Is the reading level appropriate, or am I using business terms that my users may not know? Content organization, can I tell what in the world I'm looking at? And interactions, can I tell what I can even interact with, such as links or buttons? Navigate, can I make my way through the application from contact section to section and from screen to screen? There are a couple ways this can be hindered. I can't find or get the link buttons themselves, or I don't understand how the interface works and can't figure out how to navigate in the first place. Contribute, can I participate in a social media application? Can I create a post, for example? Can I publish an application to the web? These 5 conditions are the basis to which an application is accessible to user. So let's look at what some barriers are that would prevent us from being able to accomplish any of these 5 things. Please keep in mind that I've neatly categorized these. In the real world, humans are not that simple or clean cut, and we may be hindered by any combination across these categories. Hindrance can be auditory, our ability to hear. 15% of the world's population has some kind of hearing loss. If we just consider disabling hearing loss, which is defined by a loss of greater than 40 decibels in the better ear or 30 in children, the number is up to 466 million, or about 5% of the world's population. By 2050, it's estimated that 900 million people, or about 10% of the world's population, will be affected. Causes may include exposure to loud noises, genetics, injury, age, and illness. Worth noting are users over the age of 65 because 1/3 are estimated to be currently affected. Visual related to the ability to see, around 1.3 billion people worldwide have some form of visual impairment. This can vary from mild to substantial uncorrectable vision loss in one or both eyes. Refractive errors are the most common reason. Refractive errors encompass nearsightedness, farsightedness, and curved cornea, which cause distortion. Basically, what you usually see glasses to correct. In 2010, these were cause for visual impairment in 101.5 million people, and blindness in 6.5 million people worldwide. Other common causes for visual impairment include cataracts, a clouding of the lens which prevents clear vision, glaucoma, which is a group of diseases characterized by damage to the optic nerve caused by increased fluid and pressure in the eye, and color blindness, which happens when the pigments in the cones which allow us to determine color do not function properly or are absent. Physical disabilities include limitations of movement, mobility, dexterity, or stamina, which can affect keyboard and mouse use. This can be a result of muscle weakness, including tremors, lack of coordination, paralysis, numbness, or diminished sensation, joint disorder, hampered movement, or missing limbs. There are a multitude of causes of physical disabilities. Examples include amputation, rheumatisms, injury, or disorders such as muscular dystrophy or fibromyalgia. This brings us to a sidebar about impairments and disabilities. When you think of injuries, for example, an injury can have permanent repercussions, such as a broken spine causing paralysis, or it can be very temporary. Stitches on a hand limiting movement and causing discomfort while there, but healing just fine. We have mentioned a lot of permanent disabilities up to this point and talked a lot about impairments, but it's worth noting that handicapped, impairment, and disabled have distinct meaning. An impairment is a loss or an abnormality of function, of structure of mind or body. A disability is the restriction or prevention in performing an action, while the handicap is the disadvantage that the disability causes. As an example, a macular abnormality such as cataract, which is the impairment, this causes blindness, the disability, which may prevent my ability to get a driver's license, the handicap. It does not take an impairment to be disabled. There are, broadly speaking, 3 different types of disabilities. Situational. The current context in which we find ourselves causes the impairment. For example, sitting in a crowded, noisy subway and needing to use subtitles while watching a video. We use the subtitles because we can't hear or understand what is being said due to the background noise. Temporary, breaking my glasses and zooming in on a screen or using a magnifier to find the nearest optician. And finally, permanent, which, as its name implies, is persistent. So far, we've covered auditory, visual, and physical. We have two more categories. Cognitive and neurological, which are things that affect the central and peripheral nervous systems. The central nervous system includes the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nerve includes nerves and ganglia that are not part of the brain and spinal cord. This is probably the broadest and most diverse category, including a wide range of causes such as dementia, one of the most common and growing as the world's population as a whole is aging. Epilepsy, which affects over 50 million people worldwide. Illnesses such as meningitis, Zika, or COVID-19. Injuries, strokes, or Parkinson's. And lastly, speech, which affects the ability to pronounce or enunciate in a way that is recognizable by others or by voice recognition software. Examples of speech impairments include apraxia, which occurs when neural pathways used to control speech in muscles do not function properly. The person may know what they want to say but are unable to articulate it. Apraxia is typically caused by strokes, dementia, brain tumors, or traumatic brain injuries. Stuttering, also known as stammering, is a form of disfluency typed by verbal blocks, prolongations, and repetitions, making it difficult to speak clearly or rapidly. This also includes vocal tics, which are involuntary productions of sounds or movements such as throat clearing or palilalia, repeating one's own words. The exact cause is unknown. And dysarthria, which is a speech disorder caused by a malfunction of the nerve or muscles involved in producing speech, such as the diaphragm, lips, tongues, or vocal cords. This can lead to slurred or slowed speech, limited range of motion of the tongue, jaw, or lips, difficulty articulating, and many other symptoms. Now that we have a general understanding of accessibility and the broad range of obstacles users may experience while trying to use our products, let's look at how we can get started to make our application accessible. First things first, how big of a job is it going to be, right? Before we even look at the application itself, we need to make sure that we understand what standards we should be testing against and following. Those may be legal, best practice, or both. A term you may have heard in the United States related to accessibility is Section 508. This refers to Section number 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which has specific accessibility guidelines related to electronic and information technology. These are applicable to government work mostly. You may also hear the ADA mentioned, the American with Disabilities Act. It does not contain any specific guidelines on how to make the web accessible, though. These point to the Web Accessibility Guidelines put forth by W3, the World Wide Web Consortium. These guidelines are separated into three distinct categories: the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guideline, or ATAG. These would be applicable to applications that create content, such as a Content Management System or CMS. User Agent Accessibility Guidelines, or UAG. These are for browsers. If you were to create your own browsers, these would be guidelines to follow. And finally, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These outline best practices for websites and web applications. WCAG has three levels of conformance outlined: A, AA, and AAA, which would build on each other, with AAA being the most restrictive. For the average web application, you'll most likely need WCAG AA. However, I am not a lawyer. When trying to figure out what guidelines and levels of accessibility an application or website needs to conform to, talk to your lawyer or your legal team. They will be able to help you ascertain what, if any, your industry and countries you do business with will require, or if you have any contractual agreements with your clients. Once the guidelines we need to conform to have been settled upon, we need to baseline our application. Actually understand what the current state of things are so we know what we're going to need to fix. Similarly to security, for example, accessibility does not happen by accident. If you have not taken it into consideration during your development, you will have errors in areas that need improved upon. To test, however, we can't test all browsers and devices ever created. We therefore need to decide if, and has not been done already, which browsers we are going to support. Across all devices, Chrome and Safari account for about 82% of the market share alone. They also lead the charge for desktop and mobile. Looking at desktop statistics on the upper right-hand side, as a front-end developer and to my great chagrin, I feel the need to point out IE, which as of June 2020 still holds about 2.88% of the market share. Any given application's browser usage will vary. Being in tune with our analytics can help us make a better decision as to what to test for. Worth noting, it is not because an application has a very small percent of, say, mobile users, that we should therefore ignore mobile. Knowing but also understanding why our numbers are what they are is very important. If an application is unusable on mobile, the stats are not going to show a lot of mobile users. It does not mean that our users don't want to use it on mobile. This distinction is very important to understand when interpreting our data. This leads to devices and technologies we will test with. This not only includes which phones, smartwatches, and what have yous we choose, but also which assistive devices we need to test with. We can use analytics to know which phone versions our users are using to narrow our scope, but cannot for assistive devices. Analytics purposely do not and cannot register if a user is using a screen reader, for example. This is to protect the privacy of the user and to prevent discrimination. Information on the use of assistive technologies is therefore very limited. WebAIM has conducted surveys to better understand what assistive technologies are being used. However, the sample is small and potentially skewed. Their results show that JAWS is the most commonly used screen reader, with about 21% of respondents using it in conjunction with Chrome. NVDA is close second at 20%. When aggregating data from previous years' surveys, they show a decrease in the use of JAWS and IE and an increased usage in NVDA and Chrome. NVDA and VoiceOver have the market benefit of being free. NVDA is open source, and VoiceOver come installed as part of the Mac OS, which could explain their increase in popularity over the last several years. Screen readers are obviously not the only assistive technologies out there. WebAIM has a number of surveys regarding the use of assistive technologies, which, along with surveying our own users, can help us make decisions on what to test with. At this juncture, we know what specification we will follow and what browsers and devices we're going to use. This is a great time to start working on our accessibility statement. The purpose of an accessibility statement is to tell our users that we care about accessibility and how to get a hold of us with any feedback or questions. An accessibility statement should include a commitment to accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities, the specific standards we are conforming to, the browsers and tools with which we tested, any other known limitations. Our application is obviously not going to be accessible overnight. So as we make portions of the application accessible, the known limitations sections will need updated to reflect areas that are now accessible and those that still need work. W3.org has an accessibility statement generator that can help us get started. Here is an example generated using this tool for Example App being produced by Example Inc. Example Inc. is committed to ensuring digital accessibility for people with disabilities. We are continually improving the user experience for everyone and applying the relevant accessibility standards. Conformance status, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, defines requirements for designers and developers to improve accessibility for people with disabilities. It defines 3 levels of conformance, level A, level AA, and level AAA. Example App is partially conformant with WCAG 2.1, level AA. Partially conformant means that some part of the content do not fully conform to accessibility standards. Feedback, we welcome your feedback on the accessibility of Example App. Please let us know if you encounter accessibility barriers on Example App. Email accessibility@example.org. We try to respond back within 2 business days. Because Example App is partially compliant, we would want to add some details about what it is and what is not. Next, we want to make sure we understand the different user flows and processes in our application. Conditions such as access roles, data states, and other app states can influence what we show or hide our users. It's important that we know what those conditions are and what those screens or components that are being shown or hidden are so they can be appropriately tested. Breakpoints are used to make applications responsive and therefore alter how the user interfaces is presented to us. Breakpoints allow us to conditionally change how we style the UI based on our environment. Layout can therefore be adjusted depending on if we are looking at our website on a narrow screen, a phone, a widescreen, or desktop. They can be implemented any number of ways. A very common method is via media queries. These are implemented via CSS and allow for styles to be applied conditionally based on the current state of the environment. This includes the width of the viewport. Styles can be applied based on media types. When we go to print something and the page printed differs from what we see on the screen, this is often done using media queries. Media types include print, screen, and speech. CSS media queries are not the only way to achieve these ends. We can also be achieved via JavaScript, for example. We need to make sure that we are keeping track of what all our breakpoints in our application are so that we can test while each condition is being met, as they may result in a change of layout, what is being displayed, or general styles. Lastly, we know which parts of our application are under our control versus, if any, what third-party integrations we have. These should be evaluated for accessibility. Some questions to ask are, is it accessible? If not, can it be made accessible? Do we really need it? If yes, is there a better, different, other integration we can use that is or can be made accessible? If there is no other option than the use of the non-conformant integration, then we should issue a statement of partial conformance. An example would be, our example page does not conform, but would conform to WCAG 2.1 at level AA if the following parts from uncontrolled sources were removed. Having established what to test and on what, let's look at how to test. The options for accessibility testing tools are quite vast, but we can look at them in terms of what they do. Starting as close to the root as possible, we have linters and validators, run via GUI, command line, or integrated into a developer's editor to highlight issues with code. They check for syntactical problems. Code that does not compile correctly in the browser is not going to be accessible. Think of this as the spell check and grammar check for code. Browser plugins such as Lighthouse or Accessibility Insights for Web can run static analysis on compiled code to catch some accessibility issues. They're a great first step. However, they can give us a false sense of security or accomplishment. They can only test for a fraction of accessibility issues. They cannot, for example, check whether or not the entire page is accessible without touching a mouse. Manual testing is absolutely necessary in order to fully check for compliance. Simulators are interesting and can help illustrate a point, but one thing they cannot do is account for coping mechanisms and strategies acquired over time by someone who lives day in and day out with an impairment. Furthermore, research is conflicted as to whether they truly raise awareness and empathy or do more harm than good by instilling pity. So proceed with caution. If we need data about how our users are interacting with the app, well-implemented user experience research will yield more wholesome and accurate data than any simulator. The same way, if we support mobile iOS, we would test on iPhones. If we support the voice-over screen reader, we should test with it. I think it goes without saying that what we have described up to this point is a whole lot of work. So how do we get our team on board? Once again, please keep in mind that I have neatly carved out roles for what individuals on a team or in an organization might do for ease of conversation. We all know the real world is never this neat. We're going to look at 6 different roles and how they are impacted by adding accessibility to the development process, starting with leadership. Leaders will gain some new responsibilities, including being supportive to accessibility efforts being conducted, making sure it is included as one of the business goals, and budgeting for training and software the team may need. Managers and product owners will more than likely need to collaborate with legal entities in determining what conformance levels need to be met. And very importantly, because there will be added work, make sure time is appropriately budgeted for said work. Business stakeholders will need to understand the importance of accessibility and help advocate for it. Because let's face it, if as a team member I don't feel the leadership values my efforts, or if as a leader I don't empower my team, we're already off to a rocky start. Marketing, branding, design, this is a very broad bucket. That may, depending on how big of an organization we have, may be completely separate teams, which means that collaboration is going to be very important. Any one of these entities may be responsible for the look and feel of the application, including artifacts and branding. What I'm referring to here are things you might find in a style guide. So brand colors, if brand colors are they accessible, typefaces, and language use. If accessibility cannot be achieved while following brand guidelines, the likelihood of friction existing between the brand managers and design and development team is pretty high. If by following brand standards we're already compliant in terms of color to contrast ratios, fonts being readable, and language being appropriate for our application audience, we can start on some solid foundations and decrease tensions down the road. Providing alternate text for pictures out of the gate and making sure that videos have subtitles and transcripts when handed over to the development team will also greatly increase accessibility out of the gate. Web designers, those doing the design of the application or website itself, will also need to consider the following in their designs. Do my designs pass color contrast ratios? Am I always using more than just color to convey meaning? An example of this would be form validation errors. Do I have red text under my form field or something else as well with it to indicate that it is an error, such as an icon or the word error? Font size, is my text readable on small screens? Alternate navigation options, is there more than one way to navigate my application? Is it intuitive? Can users ascertain where they are, where they were, and where they're going? Content organization, not only is the content organized in a way that is easy to follow and understand, but also are headers being used appropriately. Collaboration with brand managers, marketing, development, anyone doing user research, etc. This is a good time to talk about personas. Oftentimes in design we use personas. There are several schools of thought as to whether or not they are useful. That is for each team to decide. However, some words of caution specifically related to personas and disability. Personas are often oversimplified caricatures of what an actual user might be. When creating personas around accessibility, we need to make sure that the persona is still as wholesome as it can be. In other words, a persona is not just a disability. Jane is blind makes a terrible persona. A better way is to include the nature of the disability and strategies used by the persona. To rehash the previous example, Jane uses the application to keep track of her grocery list. She uses VoiceOver on her phone to read out each item on the list and text-to-speech in order to create new items. This is still a very shallow example and could use a lot more work, but is a step in the right direction. Content creators. Content creators can take any form. Maybe they're writing content into a content management system that auto-publishes to the application, or a video production team creating advertisement for the application, or the options are limitless. We all need to consider the medium in which we're creating and what specific requirements each may have. Some common things to keep in mind include heading structures. Are they sequentials and do they make sense? If media for video and audio are transcripts and or subtitles available. For images, did I also create the appropriate alternate text? For written content, is the reading level appropriate for my audience? For the average adult in the United States, it's still 3rd grade. Am I using business or industry-specific vocabulary? If so, is it appropriate to use with my target audience? Is the text on my links and buttons descriptive, enough to give the sense to my users of what will happen if they click it? Hint, read more is terrible. A much better option would be read more about puppies, kittens, and rainbows. When it comes to content management systems, WordPress, templates, and other authoring tools, be aware that not all of them are capable of producing accessible output. Developers will be the ones writing the application. To be successful, we need to be aware of the standards we need to be abiding to. Be familiar with ARIA. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which is a framework for making applications more accessible. This is especially important for dynamic content. We also need to understand semantic markup and testing tools available to us to help check that what we are creating is in fact accessible. The skill set is rather specific, so training may be necessary depending on our experiences. Similarly to developer, testing and QA will have some very specific skills that they need to know or acquire. In testing, we use a combination of manual, automated, and usability testing to determine if the application is conformant. If there is a knowledge gap, such as properly handling keyboard-only navigation, for example, more than likely QA is where it will show up. Looking at the type of accessibility errors that are often discovered in QA is a great way to understand what training our team may still need. And lastly, our legal, compliance, human resource team. We have touched on legal earlier, and this group's responsibility still revolves around the same idea of determining and communicating what compliance level specific guidelines we need to follow. We may also be tasked with producing the accessibility statement and any other supporting documentation needed. So how do we get our team motivated to basically be excited about doing extra work? Michael Norton said, when you incent people, optimize for reward. When you inspire, people optimize for purpose. We can try to inspire, but if that doesn't work, we can look at what are our motivators. We are going to look at 4 common motivators that we can use to help get everyone on board. Many of these can be at play at any given time. First is ethical, being motivated by ethics. The fact that accessibility is the right thing to do because it helps provide all users equal access to information and services usually leads the best results. Legal, there may be, as part of the contract, country in which business is being conducted, or industry, a legal requirement that requires us to adhere to an accessibility standard. Not getting sued or losing a contract is usually a pretty good motivator. Motivations can be economic. In the United States alone, there are 49 million people with disability whom control an estimated $175 billion in discretionary income. For many businesses, this can represent 20% of their market. And finally, personal. The reasons can vary wildly, but are often related to personally having a close friend or family members, or personally being affected by accessibility in some way. Regardless, it's important that we use positive motivations, such as encouragements and rewards, rather than negative ones like guilt and punishment if we want long-term success. So we know what we need to do, and we're getting people on board with the idea. We have baselined our application. Now the real work begins. So let's break it down into phases so that it does not become overwhelming, and so that we can maintain accessibility long term. Because accessibility is not a one and done. If we overhaul our app and then don't consider accessibility again until the next audit, we'll find ourselves back at square one. So I've broken it down into 5 phases. Phase 0, finding our allies. The good news is that by this point, we're already a good way through this phase. We are already motivating people. Some final details need ironed. What is our team's skill level and awareness of accessibility? Do we need to secure some training? Do timelines need adjusted in order to account for training time and learning curve? Do we need to revisit who is responsible for what, or edit team agreements such as coding standards, testing procedures? Does documentation need updated to reflect new tools or processes? And who is going to do it? So we're finally ready to start fixing things. Phase 1, start with the big and easy wins. Fix low-hanging fruit. Some issues are easier to fix than others, either because they're technically easy to fix or simply that the error and how to fix it is just better understood by the team. These are great errors to start with because they allow us to play with the tools and figure out which ones are going to work well for us as a team. They also allow our first taste of making a product accessible a success, therefore allowing us to start and proceed on a good note. This brings us to narrowing down tools. At this point, we should be coming to a consensus about what tools we like, don't like, what we need to do, etc. Being comfortable with our tooling and understanding its capabilities and limitations will help us ensure a successful outcome. While choosing tools, it's great time to consider testing automation. Do we have it? Should we have it? What should that look like? How does automated accessibility testing fit into that puzzle? To choose what would be considered a big win, there are some questions we might be asking ourselves. What components are repeated on multiple pages? If in a component-based architecture such as Angular, React, or Vue, some components may be getting used absolutely everywhere. These are great candidates because they have a high level of impact on the user. Navigation, headers, and footers are all great candidates as well. What are some frequently encountered errors? What is the most common error we're seeing? Understanding why, how to fix it, and then implementing a fix will have a very high level of impact on the user. Color contrast, is my theme accessible? Is my CSS architected in a way that getting that fix is going to be easy to change? If we have continuous integration and deployments, we also don't want to forget to include automated testing with our other testing in those pipelines. Once we have heavy hitters out of the way, we can start focusing a bit more closely on critical paths and features for phase 2. Our development cycle should look something like what we have over on the right. Develop and edit our feature, run our automated tests. Once those pass, we can do full manual audit and fix anything wrong there. Regression testing is important because if we focus solely on the component of the page, we want to make sure that the page as a whole is still accessible. For example, we may have a dialog box of some sort, and the inside of the modal may be ship-shape and pass compliance with flying colors, but if the users can't get in and out of it without using a mouse, we've got problems. Only by testing on the full page with the full context we'll be able to determine that it holds the focus trap. And finally, user feedback. It's sometimes easy to forget that the reason we are doing all of this is to create a better experience for all of our users. Questions we may want to be asking at this juncture are, what are our current demographics? Does our application work well for them? Do before and after analytics show improvements? Where and when is our application being used? The context in which our user find themselves can drive some usability decisions. What are our users telling us? Are they pointing to a particular feature or part of the application that should be addressed first? Is the application internationalized? If so, are we taking culture, writing direction, and font size into consideration? Font sizes for different alphabets may not be the same in order for the text to be legible. What are the different roles for a particular flow, and do these need handled differently? Focus groups are a great way to know how well your application is working for your users and can give you invaluable information on how they're using it. At this point, we're also starting to run into some more difficult accessibility issues to resolve. We got our easy ones out of the way in phase 1 and are coming up against some more involved challenges. This is a great time to look at if our team needs more guidance or training. Phase 3, our application is now accessible, and we want to keep it that way. This means that we need to make sure that all new development follows our development cycle and gets tested. This is also the time where we can start seeing what effects we have had on our user base. We should also continue to monitor and regularly reevaluate technology use, not just from an accessibility initiative, but trend changes and new devices regularly go to market. What are our users telling us? Is it good? Where can we still improve? Are legal requirements still the same? Have the specification evolved? Especially once we have our application fully accessible, but also regularly afterwards, external audits can be very helpful in making sure we don't miss anything and telling us if any more training on a specific aspect of accessibility is needed. This phase will continue on for the rest of the life of the application, but once we are comfortable here, we can also start implementing phase 4. Phase 4 revolves around documentation and scaling. We want to make sure our documentation is up to date for what is our process and tools. This will help us keep our team accountable and make onboarding of new members a lot smoother. This can also be the springboard used to show other teams in our organization what we have accomplished and give them a pathway to get there for their application so that we can start building an accepted standard practice in accessibility in our entire organization. We covered a lot today, including what accessibility is, what obstacles do we encounter trying to use our applications, things to consider when baselining our applications so that we know where we are and where we're going, how as members of a team our roles will change, and finally, how to set ourselves up to make our application accessible and keep it that way. If you enjoyed this talk and would like to know more, check out my book, Approachable Accessibility: Planning for Success. Thank you for listening. You can find me on the web at martine.dev or reach out to me on Twitter at @martine_Dowden. Thank you very much and happy coding.
Hey, it's Joe Eames with ng-conf. If you like that video, be sure to click subscribe either here or here, somewhere over here. And if you're looking for something more, here's another video for you to watch here or there or somewhere.